we found that men typically perform better with men coaches, and women did too up until maybe they were in their 40s. Then you start to see a change where maybe women coaches benefit women more at those later stages in life. And whether it's the later stage in life or maybe just that span of time when they're available, it's hard to say. You know, we'll certainly need more research following up on this to find out more. And it can come from several different areas, whether it's experiments. Our study was these people already self-selected their coaches. Whereas if we ran an experiment, we could say, okay, well, we're going to take this group and give them men coaches and this group and give them women coaches. And then we'd be able to see a lot more of that causal relationship of what might be going on.
All right, Jeremy, welcome to Evidence Strong. If you could introduce yourself and what you do in your research, that would be great.
Sure, I'm Jeremy Foreman. I'm an associate professor at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I teach the undergraduate and graduate courses in applied statistics, and my area of research is looking at coaching opportunities, primarily coaching in North American sport leagues, and looking at just opportunities for them to get promoted or when they get fired and things like that.
All right, so I contacted you because you authored a paper titled "The Effect of Coach Gender on Competitive Weightlifting Performance for Men and Women Weightlifters." So I'm very excited to have you and discuss this paper. So let's start with what is social identity, because I think it will create a nice base for the discussion.
Sure. So people have different identities that are associated with different spheres of their life. So athlete specific, there's these athletic identities. If you wind up getting out of sport, there's theories about how it's hard to transition, whether it's voluntarily like retirement or involuntarily like an injury. If you've got a really strong athletic identity, it can be hard to transition. Identities can be complex too. They can, especially for females or women. And so when men have these identities, you know, they're often consistent with other social identities, like being masculine, especially in weightlifting. Whereas when women have these social standards and athletic identities, and sometimes they conflict or seemingly conflict. And so they can be a lot more complex in those situations, I guess, when society views a certain sport as being masculine and you're feminine or want to be feminine, want to portray yourself as feminine. And sometimes they can seemingly conflict. So it's pretty complex for women in stereotypically or masculine. It wasn't something that we specifically researched, and I don't know if there's a lot of literature on the topic, but there is a lot of research on, you know, coach-athlete relationships and how coaches should be there to both mentally and emotionally support their athletes. And so when you've got a wide variety of athletes, it's helpful to have coaches with diverse backgrounds who can understand what the athletes are going through. There was a time when coaching was a lot more focused on just the physical elements of training, but we now know that there's a lot more to coaching than just the physical elements, the mental and emotional, all those psychological factors that go into coaching. And so we know that coaches need to cater to that side as well and understand these different identities.
Okay, so going into the study, could you tell us a little bit, because we know that it's about the relationships between coaches and athletes. Now, what was your population? Who did you research? How many participants did you have, and so on?
So we found this interesting data set that was available on the USA weightlifting site. And in 2011, they listed all the participants, their birth dates, their names, their coaches' names. So that data was really easy to get. And so we collected all that data and started going through those names to see if they were traditionally male names or female names. So we started categorizing them, myself and the other researchers that were part of this paper, and ensuring that we were sort of consistently and categorizing these names as potentially a man or a woman. And some of them, we would look more into, like, if we got a name like Sam, it might be Samantha, it might be Samuel. So we'd do internet searches to try and find these people. And if we could find them, then we would categorize them. If we couldn't find them, then they were excluded from the sample. So a few of them were excluded for that reason. We wound up with over 3,000 observations, over 3,000 participants in this study. About a third of them were women weightlifters, and about 2/3 were men. And coaching wise, there were about 8% of the sample had women coaches. That's about almost 7% were women coaches of men, and about a little over 12% were women coaches of women weightlifters.
Wow. That's a huge difference.
There's very few women coaches out there, with only like 8% of the sample having women coaches. But yeah, there's almost double the percent of women coaches were coaching women than compared to men.
Okay, so we know what the situation was, and now you were a little bit further into the data, and you were trying to how the coach gender would affect the performance of the athlete.
Yeah, and so we had a few different ideas of what might be going on, and based on other coaching studies. But and there's been a lot of talk about, especially in North American sport leagues, about women getting into coaching men's sports. And I guess similarly in this situation, we've got a lot of men coaching women's sports, but we've also got a lot of North American sports where men coach a lot of women. So like our women's softball, women's basketball are often not primarily, but maybe half the coaches in those areas are men coaching women's sports. And so yeah, we wanted to see what sort of effects we would see here in not only a individual sport, but a very traditionally and stereotypically masculine sport, right? So yeah, we dug into the data. We ran some regressions to try and find some statistically significant relationships, which basically just means, that we are looking for relationships that aren't likely occurring due to random chance. And we found that men typically perform better with men coaches, and women did too, up until, maybe they were in their 40s. Then you start to see a change where maybe women coaches benefit women more at those later stages in life. And whether it's the later stage in life, or maybe just that span of time when they're available, it's hard to say. We'll certainly need more research following up on this to find out more. And it can come from several different areas, whether it's experiments, because this was where our study was, these people already self-selected their coaches. Whereas if we ran an experiment, we could say, okay, well, we're going to take this group and give them men coaches, and this group and give them women coaches. And then we'd be able to see a lot more of that causal relationship of what might be going on. But this is the best sort of data that we have on this topic right now. And so, take it with a grain of salt, but it's certainly not an end all be all study, but it certainly speaks to some issues that need to be further addressed.
Yeah, so I don't know that study was thought about that, but I'm dying to ask why you think male coaches did better across till the age of 40, and then it was better for female athletes to have female coaches.
Yeah, it's interesting, certainly, and why. I can't say definitively why, but some ideas that we've talked about that this might be occurring, why this might be occurring, could be that maybe those older women who have older women coaches have coaches who have made it through all these barriers and still have wound up being successful. It could be that, the best performers are self-selecting men coaches because they're the most experienced. And it might not be necessarily because men coaches are better than women coaches. It could just be that that's who the best athletes, men or women, are selecting as coaches, the ones who are the highest performers, because they've got so much more experience and haven't faced these barriers as women have. So it could be a wide number of things. I certainly wouldn't say that men are better coaches, but in this study, we see that the athletes who happen to have men coaches are performing better, except for the more mature women lifters with the women coaches.
What would you advise? First, let's go with the coaches, how they should navigate working with female or male athletes. And is there anything that they should be aware of or pay attention to, or maybe intentionally do or work on?
So I certainly think that, like any other training program, it needs to be individual specific, right? And so there are probably differences between men and women in terms of coaching that benefit certain people, certain athletes more than the other. And a lot of that, there's so much research out there about differences between men and women in terms of, communication and leadership and all this stuff. There's communication studies about, how, for example, men could be perfectly content sitting side by side by each other on a bench, facing forward and communicating that way, whereas women might be more comfortable being face to face, and how women and men angle to talk to each other. So, understanding each other's comfort levels, I think, is important, and in communication styles and in the struggles that they've gone through their sporting experiences. I think being able to understand all this is important. Of course, as a coach, you also want to know what you're doing and, get certifications and stay up to date on the latest information from Evidence Strong is putting out and all this, peer-reviewed research. And so being able to stay abreast on that and being able to communicate, I think, are two things that coaches can really do to ensure that they can best work with men or women.
Now let's jump to the other side. So would you have any advice for athletes, how they should go about choosing a coach and how they should go about building this relationship, or how communication or whatever you think would be useful for them to know?
If you're in a situation where you don't feel like you're being heard, or you can't openly communicate with your coach, then maybe you need to find a different coach who you can better communicate with. But aside from that, the most experienced coaches aren't always the best coaches. And so even though somebody may not have a lot of experience because, for example, maybe they experienced a lot of barriers getting where they got, then they might still be a very good coach. Or, if a coach is a woman when everybody else is a man, that doesn't mean that you should go with a man coach. Maybe that woman has gone through all those barriers and still has been successful. And so I would just say, aside from the communication and the knowledge, understanding that coaches can come from a lot of different backgrounds and be successful could be helpful.
Find a coach for you.
Certainly, yeah, it's very, very individualistic. And a lot of these studies are based on averages. So, or trends, right? And not everybody fits those trends. If say most people are like kinesthetic learners and you're more of an auditory learner, then maybe you need somebody who can coach that. But, so yeah, definitely finding the right person for you.
Such a good point.
I think that there's always new information coming out, and I think the best coaches are going to be the ones that are always pushing the limits of understanding and science and saying, here's the latest and greatest information that's out there. Let's try it out, instead of, this is how we did in the 1970s and it worked for me, so let's keep doing how I was coached.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I wanted to wrap up with a question about you as a researcher. No, so I think it's important to introduce the authors of the studies and show that you are people too, and you care about the research and you want to do it the best as you can. So I have two questions, one more serious one and one a cheeky one about you as a researcher. And the first one of these is, what are you the most proud of as a researcher?
So I will say that I find a lot of joy in just finding out new information, finding new things that nobody else has found before, and just being a small part of this piece of the puzzle that, you know, if you log on to Google Scholar where there's all this peer-reviewed research, it says like stand on the shoulder of giants. And so, you know, you do that, you put your little piece of the puzzle in and sort of see where the whole thing goes, not putting, you know, all your faith in necessarily one study, but seeing how it all washes out when other people start to contribute, or when I get to go and see like, how can I advance somebody else's research and how have others advanced mine, and sharing that with students too, and getting them involved in the research process is a lot of fun.
Thank you. Like small pieces, bit by bit. That's how the big progress happens.
Absolutely.
Yes. So the second question is, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
What is your favorite color?
My favorite color? Oh gosh, you know, I used to think colors like green and brown were ugly, but now I just think they're so beautiful. And green and purple together, you know, I like them. We got Mardi Gras here in Louisiana, and green, purple, and yellow are all around Carnival, and so it's a good time of season. That's what's going on right now. We get our king cakes that have green, yellow, and purple all around them, and it's wonderful.
Awesome. I noted. So your next study will get these colors on the infographic. That's a promise.
Thank you.
All right, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your time today. It was
Thank you. This was fun
to talk to you, and see you next time.
All right, Alex. Take care.